My name is Rick Wilson, and I served as an ABH-3 aviation bosun, mate, 3rd class. So I joined the Navy to see the world. I wanted to be like McHale's Navy. So where did they send me? Shore duty, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But there's always a bright side to every story. I was close to home, and I used to get home on weekends to see my folks, and that was kind of good. Well, by standards, people join the service and they go away from home, and they're away from home, and the only contact you have is by letter or by phone. Well, I had the good fortune in Philadelphia. I had some relatives. They weren't very close to my side of the family, but my aunt said, you got to look these people up, and I did. And they were so gracious and they were so hospitable. They would come pick me up on weekends, bring me up to their house, and I would spend time there and not being on a ship. And we used to go to the USO quite a bit. They provided movie tickets for us, and we had lockers where we could keep our, at that time civilian clothes were not permitted on ship or on base for below, I think, 2nd class it was. And so we had lockers at the Y, so we would leave the ship, go downtown, change, and then go do our thing. When I was stationed in Philadelphia, I was attached to a command Philippe Res Fleet. So it was basically, they called it reserve fleet. I was not a reserve. I was active duty. But everybody hears that and they say, oh, you were a reserve, and somehow along the line, and unjustifiably so, reservists tend to be considered something less than the real meal, but that's not true, in my opinion. But we had a number of ships there that, most of them were from World War II, that had been mothballed, and what they do is they seal them up, completely seal them up, and put dehumidification equipment on board the ship to slow down the corrosion process. They had what was referred to anodes, large carbon rods that were hanging over the side that were connected up to the ship to reduce the ship sitting in salt water for an extended period. And part of what I did was stand post watches, so they would have, you were responsible for your watch, 4 hours of maintaining watch over these ships, and if the ship started to flood, you had to place a phone call to the damage control people, and they would send somebody out to check it out. I worked in the electronics area, and I was the new kid on the block, so I did a lot of swabbing decks and stuff like that. But I did get to do a little bit of electronics work, which was really good, and it was a very small unit that I worked in, and the guys were really, really exceptional. Well, we were on a ship. It was a tender, and it was just a barracks that had no engine in it. Well, it wasn't going anywhere, but we were on it as a barracks. It had a chow hall and anything else you required, and it was called the USS Chandeleur. I can't remember any of there was probably 100 ships there if there was one, and you didn't get intimately involved with any of them, really. I think the New Jersey was there, and I'd never seen up close a battleship, and I think one day we had to go over there and get some parts. So that was quite an experience, given the history of that vessel. The other part of what we were responsible for was occasionally an active ship. They were being decommissioned and deactivated, and we were called upon to perform those kind of duties to help the crew of those ships to deactivate them. And then Vietnam situation was developing and ongoing, and what they decided to do was take a couple of LSTs, landing ship tanks with the doors at the front, and convert them to 1960 technology, which entailed us to go on board, and being in the electronics is rip out all the World War II technology and install 1960 technology, and I was involved in that. I wasn't involved in the actual design part of it, so I don't know what they had to do, but it was a pretty extensive effort. Taking this stuff out, it was, I mean, we replaced equipment that occupied a 6-foot high, 8-foot wide wall and put one box in there, and that not only took the place of what was there, but added like 100% new technology and things that they didn't have back then that we had then. So it was a fairly complicated effort, but very rewarding. And I recall, if I can tell the story, they asked, and I always liked to climb things as a youngster, and they had some UHF antennas to install on the mast. So they wanted a volunteer to climb up the mast to install these, this was on an LST, to install these antennas. So I volunteered. So my boss says to me, he says, "Have you ever been up?" I said, "Oh yeah." He says, "Okay, here's what you do," and explained to me what the job entailed. And when they preserved these ships, like electrical wiring, they would take, it was like a sealant, not unlike airplane glue, and you had to, and it just peeled off, exposing the connector, take the antennas, bolt them down, and hook up the connector. And there was 3 of them. So he gave me a safety belt and a rope and gave me a few tools. And he says, "Your safety belt's got slots on them for the tools. I mean, I'm not sure if you need this and I'm not sure if you need this, but take them both because you're high up." And we were in a shipyard environment. There was scaffolding on the up the mast. So I climbed up there, and I get up there and I hook up my safety belt and get to the first one, and I'm looking at it, and all the hardware, stainless steel hardware, was in a little bag. So I opened it up and I got all the stuff out and everything was there, and I started work. So I get the antenna up, put the 4 bolts in it, and I'm ready to tighten them up. And my boss had given me a 12-inch crescent wrench, which is a fairly large thing, and it was way too big. So I'm looking at it, I says, "I don't need this one." And I reach back to slide it in the slot in the belt. And I remember putting it in and tugging on it to make sure it was secure. And I'm back, and I got my box wrenches, and I'm working away. And again, we were in a shipyard, very, very noisy. And I sensed there was something going on down below. Pardon me, and I looked down. Well, an LSD is a tank. A tank ship carries tanks. And you have to have some ventilation, and they had these humongous ventilation ducts with these humongous fans in them. And that's the responsibility of the electricians. So the electricians were checking them out. And they're normally covered with something, so something or somebody doesn't fall in. Well, they had the great screens that were open, and the chief was down there, chief electrician, with a couple of his crew, and they were looking at it. Unbeknownst to me, the slot that I had tried to fit my crescent wrench in was much larger than the crescent wrench. And my body flexing around, it fell. It missed his head by 4 inches. And I looked down, and he's standing down there like this. And one of my mates, and I looked over at the mast, and he's coming up here. He says, "Wilson, you better not come down. The chief says he's going to kill you." So I stayed up there for a while, and the long and the short of it was when I did come down, the chief was really, really choked. And it was a dangerous situation, and yes, it was my fault. But he told me that I was going to be responsible. Then when the wrench hit the fan, and it made a hole in one of the impellers, and he said, "Okay," he says, "you're not leaving this ship until that fan blade is replaced." And they made some calls. We had to go over to another, we're to go over to another LST to get one off of that one to bring it over. And this is not a small job. So he assigned my time with an electrician, a 3rd-class electrician. And as I mentioned at the beginning, my last name is Wilson. And as ironically as it can be seen, his last name was Wilson. So here we are with the ladder up the duct, because the fan came down the bottom, and it had I think it was probably a 3-inch nut. And he had a pipe wrench on it. And he's up there, and I'm holding the ladder. The angle was very awkward, so he's up there hammering away at this thing. And I might add, this was in the middle of August in Philadelphia. Not only was it hot, it was very, very humid, and we were sweating bullets. And he was having trouble with it, and I said to him, I said, look, why don't you come down here? Let me do it. This whole effort is my fault. Why don't you come down and I will go up there? He said, okay. So he came down, and the way the ladder was situated around this large duct, you just had to get your head in. So he had his head in, almost wedged, looking up at me, and I'm up there with this hammer and this pipe wrench, and I'm whacking away at it. And it's not budging, and that should have been enough to get it off. And then I very closely looked at it, and it was a left-hand thread. So I said to him, no wonder it doesn't come off. It's a left-hand thread. So I said, I'm just going to take the wrench off and turn it around and go the other way. And at the moment that I reached up and grabbed the wrench, it popped off the nut. 8 feet down, and it hit him in the head. He couldn't, I said, watch out. And it was too late, and it came down. It actually, the fall was broken by the step, but he had on his head, and I felt so bad. I'm going, how worse can this thing get? I mean, I went down there, and I said, are you okay? He says, come on, let's go, get up there. Anyways, we got the nut off, finally, and I didn't take it right off. I unscrewed it because I didn't know how much this thing weighed, and I didn't want it dropping down, so I got the nut partially loosed, and I started yanking on the fan belt, the impeller. And it wasn't coming at all. And we pulled, he went up there and he tried it. We put like 200 pounds weight on it, and it wasn't coming off. And I was thinking, and it's 1800 by now, and I'm thinking, we could be here all night. So I said, and then you could see the slight dent in the impeller. And I said to him, I said, why do we have to replace this? Because when the noise that they heard was the wrench hitting, going around. I said, maybe there's nothing wrong with this thing. So we tightened the bolt back up, we went back up, and he energized the fan and turned it on. It was smooth as silk. So he gets on the blower and calls the chief over, and the chief comes over. And of course, as soon as the chief saw me, he says, you stand over there, and don't you come near me. And they went over, and they deemed that the impeller was suitable for duty. And that was the end of the story. Not quite. The next morning, this guy went AWOL. And I felt really, really bad because I think that my action here had something to do with that. And I felt very bad about it, but there was nothing I could do. But that was one of the more exciting things that happened when I was stationed in Philadelphia. Because as I mentioned earlier, my intent in joining the service, the Navy, was to go to sea. And I was laying in mothballs for a year and a half almost, and I was quite excited about going to sea. As a matter of fact, when I was in Philadelphia, a couple of the LSTs that the propulsion people had worked on them, and they were going to take them out for a few hours, and well, it was overnight. I think it was 24 hours, and my involvement in setting it up, I wasn't necessary to be there, and I asked my division officer if I could go on the cruise, and he was quite surprised because nobody wanted to go to sea, and he said, you really want to do this, don't you? And I said, yes sir. He says, okay. So I went out, and what an exciting experience. We had a breakdown, and we had to call the port to send a tug out to haul us back into port, but it was a very exciting experience, my first real indoctrination to life at sea, and it was quite enjoyable.